Jesus way,
oh, the Jesus way,
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way,
Oh, the Jesus way,
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me. Gonna beat my sword
Gonna beat my sword
into a plow.
into a plow.
Gonna beat my sword
Gonna beat my sword
into a plow.
into a plow.
Gonna beat my sword into a plow. Christ is king in my life now. May his peace begin with me.
It was about this time of year in 1708 when 5 men and 3 women gathered at the Eder River in Schwarzenau, Germany for a baptism that was an illegal act at the time. They had all been baptized when they were infants, but for them, they wanted an outward symbol of their new faith and a commitment to living that faith in community. An anonymous member of the group first baptized Alexander Mack, and then he in turn baptized the other 7. This new group simply called themselves Brethren. Brethren Voices met with Jeff Bach, the director of the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. It's located in the small college town of Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. We asked Jeff Bach to tell us about the Young Center.
The Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies is a part of Elizabethtown College. It was opened in 1988. The center is named for Dr. Galen Young and his wife Jessie, who gave an endowment to launch the Young Center. Don Crable was the first director here, and the first fellows were Don and Hedda Dernbaugh and John and Beulah Hostetler. And the concept of the Young Center was to create a research center to study Anabaptist and Pietist groups, the 2 traditions that led to the creation of the Church of the Brethren. The intent was to have scholars come and pursue research here, and also for the center to provide public programming to interpret that research and to encourage other researchers to come. Also, initially, the director taught classes to students. That continues. And now Don Crable is the senior research fellow also here at the Young Center, and he teaches as well. So we have undergraduate courses. We have public programming about Anabaptist and Pietist groups. And we also now sponsor 2 scholars per year on fellowships, the Snowden Fellowship and the Kreider Fellowship. This allows scholars to come for a period of up to 14 weeks and research at the Young Center on topics of their interest related to Anabaptist and Pietist studies. Additionally, we sometimes have a doctoral fellow and sponsor a student working on a doctoral degree to come and do a shorter term study period here. And all of them typically give lectures about their research in addition to our regular research that goes on here. We also welcome students from the college as well as from neighboring colleges, and doctoral students really from around the world have come to research here. In addition, we also publish a book series through Johns Hopkins University Press, Young Center Books on Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. And through those books, we disseminate the research that continues not only among our own staff, but also among other researchers that relate to Anabaptist and Pietist studies.
We understand that the Anabaptist and Pietist movement grew during a time when the church was strongly controlled by the state. But our viewers may not have much information about that time in history in Germany. Can you tell us about it?
The Anabaptist movement is a movement that emerged during the time of the Reformation, already in 1525, starting in Zurich, Switzerland. Very soon, other centers of Anabaptist activity emerged across Europe, from Austria through Germany into the Netherlands and other places as well. This group of people believed in having adult baptism rather than infant baptism. Many of them focused in different ways on the importance of Scripture. They also believed that membership in the church should be voluntary rather than automatic through infant baptism. There were various emphases in the different arms of the Anabaptist movement, and some of them disappeared in the course of the 16th century. The two groups that survive to the present are the Hutterites, who are mostly in the northern Great Plains states in Canada, and also the Mennonites, both the Mennonites of Swiss origin and the Mennonites of Dutch origin.
It's really hard to imagine a time when it was actually illegal to perform religious practices outside the auspices of the church.
Yes, the Anabaptist movement was fiercely persecuted because they insisted on adult baptism rather than infant baptism, and because they wanted to detach church membership from citizenship in the organized state. Many Anabaptists preferred pacifism and were pacifists, and that also earned them the wrath of the authorities. And so there was a severe loss of early leaders in the Anabaptist movement, and ultimately the Hutterites and the Mennonites were the groups that survived out of that time period.
We asked Jeff about how this movement was able to survive in such an environment.
Adult baptism was against the law and was often punished by death. The movement continued as the people met largely in secret for worship, in homes, sometimes in forests, or sometimes even in caves. They also tried to keep the information about their members from the authorities so that they would not be persecuted. Eventually, in the 1600s, religious toleration slowly was extended to Anabaptism, and by the 1700s, in most places, the Anabaptists had limited freedom to worship, even though adult baptism technically was still illegal.
Jeff Bach is a person who is very knowledgeable about the Pietists. He teaches about this very subject, and we ask him to tell us more about them.
The Pietist movement began some years later. Typically, people think of the beginning of the Pietist movement in 1670 in Frankfurt, Germany, when a Lutheran minister, Philip Jacob Spener, introduced small groups for mutual edification and discussion about the sermons and devotional literature into his congregation there. There are roots to Pietism that go deeper into German Protestantism and Dutch Protestantism, but for practical purposes, it's useful to say that Spener was the one who launched Pietism. Pietism was a movement to renew Protestantism from within. Spener's desire was to emphasize the use of the Scripture, both in preaching and in personal devotional reading, to emphasize prayer, to emphasize godly living and a moral life, and also he emphasized using these small groups of people getting together for upbuilding each other in their faith and in their active life as believers. This movement also was not received well by many of the church authorities. Many authorities saw this as a threat to the pastor's authority in congregations. Pietism never intended to threaten the church. Instead, they had hoped to renew it from within.
Currently, the Young Center has exhibits of Alexander Mack. He was a man who could do it all. He was a weaver by trade, and then became a pastor, a writer, and a poet. We asked Jeff to tell us more about the exhibit and the man, Alexander Mack.
The exhibit that we have on Alexander Mack Jr. here at the Young Center is being shown in 2012 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of Alexander Mack Jr.'s birth. We're also hosting an academic conference in June of 2012 to study different aspects of his life. The father of Alexander Mack Jr., Alexander Mack Sr., was the first minister and organizer of the Brethren movement in Schwarzenau, Germany, and that's where Alexander Mack Jr. was born. He spent part of his childhood in the Netherlands after 1720, and then in 1729, his family and a large group of brethren who had moved from Schwarzenau to the Netherlands came to Pennsylvania. There were already some brethren here at the time. Over the course of the years, Alexander Mack Jr. Became involved as a member at the Germantown congregation, the first congregation of the Brethren in the colonies. For a while, Alexander Mack Jr. left the Germantown congregation and lived at the monastic community at Ephrata, which was a breakaway group from the Brethren body. And then after 1748, Alexander Mack Jr. returned to Germantown. He married and also was elected to the ministry and remained an active minister throughout his life, and then he died in 1803. In many ways, Alexander Mack Jr. was the most influential minister of the 18th century for the Brethren because he lived so long. He also had a voice in many important decisions, including the order in which to do the love feast, whether feet washing would come before or after the love meal. He also gave counsel when a Brethren woman named Catherine Hummer began to receive visions, and there was a controversy over whether her visions were of God or her own imagination. And Mack, with the other Brethren elders, decided that the Brethren should not pass judgment on that.
In the early 1700s, the Brethren decided to pack it up and move to the colonies and the New World, making a settlement in Pennsylvania. What a huge decision that must have been for them. We asked Jeff about the motivations of those early Brethren.
The reasons for the Brethren to come to Pennsylvania are a little unclear. There are no exact documents that record how they made that decision. The first group came already in 1719, led by Peter Becker. That was a group from the Crefeld congregation. It's possible that the Brethren came to Pennsylvania for more economic opportunity. There's some speculation that the Brethren had left Schwarzenau in 1720 to go to the Netherlands because they anticipated that conditions might change regarding their toleration. There's some thought that perhaps some internal difficulties in Crefeld might have motivated the first group to come in 1719. When Alexander Mack Sr. came with his group from the Netherlands in 1729, they probably came for better economic conditions, and perhaps also because the Germantown church was having difficulty with Conrad Beissel at Conestoga, and in 1728 he led the break that formed the Ephrata cloister. It doesn't seem that the migration to the colonies was well planned or very consistently thought out. It seems to be more a matter that emerged gradually as they thought about where they had their best chances to flourish.
We'll be taking another look at the Young Center in just a moment. But first, here's a word about the New Community Project, which is continuing the work of Jesus, providing assistance to people in a number of places around the world.
New Community Project is a way of getting up close and personal with our world. Whether on a learning tour to Asia, Africa, the Amazon, Arctic, Central America, or closer to home, the Sustainable Living Homestead in Virginia. New Community Project invites people and communities to think about how we're treating the planet and the people who share it, and the world we're passing on to our children, and what it says about us and the things we value. New Community Project is about creating relationships with our neighbors and the creation around us, and that provide the understanding and sense of community we need to build a better future for our planet and its people. Creating relationships with our neighbors and the creation around us. Check out the website, newcommunityproject.org. The learning tours provide participants with an up-close and personal way to establish relationships with the people whose livelihood is threatened in some way. Here are the learning tours for the coming year. Harrisonburg, Virginia, Ecuador and the headwaters of the Amazon, Denali, Alaska, and Arctic Village, Alaska.
We're sharing the story of those first brethren who defied the religious authorities of their time, established a new way of living. And brethren are continuing to do that today. We're meeting with Jeff Bach of the Young Center in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania for a tour of the center. One of the exhibits is that of the Booker Meeting House, which was also typical of an early Brethren meeting house.
We're talking inside the Booker Meeting House at the Young Center. The Booker Meeting House is a plain meeting house in the style of Brethren church or meeting house buildings. It's a copy of the Germantown Meeting House, the original historic part. The meeting house is named in honor of Rufus Fouts Bucher, who was a long-time trustee for Elizabethtown College, minister among the Brethren, and also a traveling speaker and evangelist here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. The meeting house is intentionally designed to look reminiscent of the plain style of architecture for Brethren places of worship in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, a little bit into the early 20th century as well. There's no Brethren congregation that meets here, but it is a place that the college uses for many events, as well as our own programming from the Young Center. One of the items that we have here is the preacher's table from the 19th century. It's a long, narrow table that would traditionally have sat at the front of the meeting house. The ministers of the congregation would sit at the table, and they would lead the morning worship service from that place. Often a congregation would have several ministers, beginning with ministers who were just in training, ministers who were considered to be capable of leading worship, conducting baptisms and weddings, and then also the elders who would be the senior ministers in the congregation. On Sunday mornings, they would gather and take their seats and then decide among themselves who would be the main preacher, who would be the one to open worship, and then they would also give opportunity to the other ministers to have short sermons after the main preaching, to give commentary on the sermon, to give further testimony to the life in Christ and encourage others in their discipleship. These items are typical for what you would have seen at a Brethren Love Feast in the mid-1800s. This is a table and a bench that would have been stored and transported to occasions when brethren would gather for the Love Feast. Often the meeting houses were not large enough to hold all the crowd, and of course many congregations still met in homes. And so these tables and benches would be stored perhaps in a barn and then taken to barns where the Love Feast might be held, or perhaps if they had a meeting house large enough, they would be taken to the meeting house. This particular table and bench are from Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, and probably were made in the mid-1800s. On the table you'll see a pair of communion cups made of pewter that were used by the Cadorus Church of the Brethren sometime in the second half of the 1700s up until the early 1950s. Up until that time, Cadorus observed communion by having common cup for the brothers and a common cup for the sisters. And that pattern was typical for most brethren until the early 1900s. The cups are made out of pewter by Lancaster County pewterer Johann Christoph Heine. Only 4 of his cups like this survive, and 2 of them were these communion cups. They're very simple kinds of cups that would have been used in households, and so the Cadorus congregation used them for sharing the cup at the time of love feast. You'll notice that they're not elaborate or fancy like a chalice, as you might have seen in a regular Protestant or Roman Catholic congregation. These are simple cups because the brethren were plain people and put the emphasis on the meaning of the cup and the covenant with Jesus Christ rather than on how elaborate the vessel itself was. On the bottom of this cup you can see the maker's mark, but you can also see the initials BH for the Brillhart family. That was one of the families that donated the cup to the Cadorus congregation. This cup has a different insignia on the bottom. There's the maker's mark, which is the same, but you'll also notice the letters I and M, and those actually stand for the J, Johannes, and the family Meyer, the family name Meyer. That was the other family that donated this cup to the Cadorus congregation. And then the 2 cups were used after they were donated until the early 1950s.
The Young Center is also home to a very rare collection of books.
This is the reading room of the Young Center. In this room we keep our rare book collection as well as the more current books that relate to our particular research. Part of the research collection here are rare books that were donated by Hedda Dernbaugh after the passing of her husband Don. And the Dernbaugh research collection includes mostly literature from radical pietism from the 1700s, and then we have a few special treasures that we also own that I'll show you. In addition, we have a smaller collection, the Esther and Emmert or Bittinger research collection, most of which was donated by Emmert Bittinger after his retirement from his teaching career at Bridgewater College. The first book that I want to show to you is a Sauer Bible printed by Christopher Sauer in Germantown in 1743. This is Christopher Sauer I, who was a friend of Alexander Mack Sr.'s. Christopher Sauer I did not join the Brethren, but he was very sympathetic to them. To print a Bible in the 1700s was a complicated process. The paper would be laid out so that multiple pages could be printed on each side, and then the large sheet of paper had to be hung up to dry. After the ink dried, then the sheets of paper were folded to create the sequence of pages that would be visible to the reader. Groups of these sets of pages would then be stitched together in small groupings, and then to create the book, all of those groups of pages would be stitched together at the end. When you purchased a book, typically in the 1700s, it did not come in a binding. You would go to the bookseller and all you would purchase is the printed paper bound together. And then you would either contract with the printer who might know a binder who would put the binding on, or you would take your book to a binder yourself. And then you would decide what kind of binding and whether you wanted any special ornaments on the book itself. And so it took quite a while to get the Bible printed, because all of these pages had to be printed and dried and then stitched together to create the final product. Another treasure that we have in the Young Center Research Collection is a copy of the Martyr's Mirror, published in 1748 at the Ephrata Cloister. Most people don't realize that the Martyr's Mirror was the largest book ever produced in the American colonies. It was over 1,200 pages long, And it was all printed at the Ephrata Cloister starting in 1748. The Martyr's Mirror is a book that was originally created in Dutch to recount the stories of Anabaptist martyrs. The Anabaptists were fiercely persecuted, and they recorded some of the stories of their members who were killed. And a man named Tieleman Jansson van Bracht collected these and published them first in 1660, and then a second edition came out in 1685. In 1745, some of the Mennonites here in Pennsylvania wanted to have the book translated into German so that it could be understood by German-speaking Mennonites. And they requested help from the Mennonites in the Netherlands, and when their answer did not come quickly enough, they decided to approach the Ephrata Cloister about translating and printing it. And so the entire work was translated at Ephrata and published in German. This was the first edition in German.
We thank Jeff Bach of the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies for taking his time and for sharing with us some of the history of the early brethren. So where are we today? The Church of the Brethren still draws people together who want to continue the work of Jesus through faithfulness and service and a new way of living. Though the Brethren have existed for 300 years, there is still no formal creed or set of rules. We simply try to do what Jesus did. Jesus brought a message of life, love, and hope to all. But he offered much more than inspiring words. He understood that people's spiritual needs also include day-to-day human needs. Needs for food, shelter, health, rest, comfort and friendship, and unconditional acceptance. It's truly another way of living. This is Brent Carlson for Brethren Voices, wishing you peace.
He trod.
The path he trod.
All those who tread
All those who tread.
the path he trod.
The path he trod.
All those who tread the path he trod shall be called the friends of God. May his peace begin with me. Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me.